Welcome to this afternoon's webinar, and thank you for joining us in the second of UB Law's series, Examining Structural Racism. I'm Liz Keys, a professor at the UB School of Law and director of its Immigrant Rights Clinic. Our topic today is ImmigRacism. How does immigration law manifest racism and impact immigrant communities? We're looking forward to your questions, which you can submit using the Q&A function on your Zoom dashboard, and we will get to as many as we possibly can. Before we begin, I'd like to tell you about the next webinar in the UB Law in Focus discussion series on Wednesday, September 16th. Our panel that day will look at misinformation, disinformation, and fake news, a topic of particular interest as the presidential election approaches. For that, we've assembled an excellent panel of lawyers and journalists, so please check out the event by following the link on our homepage of the UB website. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce our speakers, and welcome back to alumna of our law school. Mike Mitchell is Executive Director of FERN, the Foreign Born Information and Referral Network, an organization that empowers immigrants, refugees, and asylees in Central Maryland with immigration counseling, interpretation, and translation services and resources along their journey. Prior to joining FERN, Mike was Vice President of U.S. programs at the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, HIAS, working to ensure successful resettlement of refugees. From 2012 to 2016, he was Vice President of programs for Lutheran Immigrant and Refugee Services, which welcomed 10,000 refugees to America, including unaccompanied minors, and assisted with their resettlement. Alejandra Maurici is the Senior Attorney at the Baltimore office of KIND, Kids in Need of Defense, a national organization that represents and supports kids in the immigration removal system. A first-generation immigrant herself and a 2014 grad of UB Law, Alejandra has been working tirelessly to represent immigrants in Maryland nonprofits ever since her graduation. And finally, Roxana Wise is Chief of Staff at the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, where she leads the Legislative Affairs portfolio. She joined the council after years as a state's attorney in Montgomery County. A 2013 grad of UB Law, she has done direct representation of immigrants during and after law school, and she is on the board of an important Washington, D.C. nonprofit serving low-income immigrants, CARESN. She also serves on the Maryland Department of Juvenile Services State Advisory Board, where she works on anti-racism initiatives. Clearly, in their work, our three panelists have championed immigrants in multiple spheres, from the immigration and family courts to accessing public benefits and addressing homelessness. Our conversation will focus on issues of race and immigration today, but before starting that conversation, it's important to share some of what has led to this current moment immigration-wise, and I'm going to use my professor and moderator privilege to give just the briefest of overviews of some of the ways race and intersection intersect. First, immigration law is an area of law where we do not need to do any deep or subtle critique to find abundant evidence of racism. It is present in the foundational laws and court cases that gave rise to the existence itself of federal immigration law in the late 19th century. The very first immigration statute was called the Chinese Exclusion Act, and there is a link on the announcement for this event to the PBS series about that law. Suffice it to say, the racial intent is clearly in the title. But even more disturbing and yet very familiar to modern ears is the language of the Supreme Court case that upheld the constitutionality of that law in 1889. That decision justified the immigration power as a means of fighting off an immigrant invasion. It spoke of the hordes of unassimilable Chinese who would, quote, overrun our country, that their presence was a menace to our civilization. First, despite the overt racism in this decision, it is still good law and still routinely cited in the vast majority of Supreme Court cases that contemplate immigration. Second, these concerns with invasion and assimilation clearly echo in the Trump administration's depictions of immigrants generally and Mexican and Central American immigrants in particular, but not exclusively. They also echo every single wave of immigrants who has ever come to this country. The Irish generated fears of unassimilability. The Italians and Germans were condemned for their linguistic enclaves. Americans born of Japanese descent were so little accepted as full Americans that our nation imprisoned them in World War II. And our laws too long have reflected those fears and attitudes. In 1924, Congress passed a law setting immigration levels to those of 1890, which was before Russians and Italians and Greeks arrived. Those same immigrants who we celebrate in our Ellis Island mythology were the ones the 1924 Congress was trying to have fewer of. They wanted explicitly to preserve the dominance of Western European white migrants. That same law banned all immigration from Asia. Quotas, these 1924 quotas remained in place until 1965, after which our immigration sources diversified significantly. But that same law, for the first time, imposed numerical limits on Mexico, putting a cap on what had been a long history of free-flowing back and forth migration between Mexico and the United States, and essentially creating the phenomenon of illegal immigration from Mexico. And as our immigration law has intersected more and more with criminal law and the criminal legal system since 1996, and with heightened enforcement against certain Middle Eastern and South Asian communities since 2001, the same issues of over-policing of communities of color generally mean that immigrant communities of color end up forming a disproportionate percentage of those removed from the country. We will get into all of these things and more in this conversation, and I hope you will ask questions about any of this in the chat. And again, we will get to as many of those questions as we can. First, and I'm going to add myself, our wonderful colleagues behind the scenes are adding links. I'm going to add one that just came up this week for further reading. But to get into the discussion, Alejandra, I wanted to start with you. You do so much work with asylum seekers and their families, and most, if not all, are people of color. It's a big question, but how do you see race and racism affecting our asylum system?
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm so happy to be here. I love UB. I went to UB, and Liz was also a great part of why my experience was so great there. So I want to start off by saying that I also wanted to say that race is very interesting for Hispanic immigrants. And I'm going to say that also from my personal standpoint of view. It is always a weird question to answer when we have to say what our race is, because we don't think in those terms. It really seems to be a bigger deal here in the United States. For us, ethnicity, I think, is a bigger source of, I guess, origin, or the way that we identify ourselves. So race is very interesting. But what I see is what we see in many other realms, which is that minorities, which tend to be those of color, are the most affected by certain policies that are introduced as being neutral. And I love that you mentioned a brief history of immigration, because I have been thinking a lot about like the Chinese Exclusion Act, or after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and how we dealt with things, sending people into camps and like physically creating separations, right? It's like a system that does this very well. And I work primarily with children. I work for KIND, which is Kids in Need of Defense. By the time we intake the children are already in removal proceedings. So most of the children that we see are people who are coming across the border, the southern border, and those are people of color. And we've seen a lot of people from Haiti coming in that way. So it's not just limited to Central America. We've also seen like South America, which is a bigger travel, but there is definitely a lot of people coming into the southern border, and they are people of color. Right now, I was thinking of those camps when I was thinking of the MPP and the Migrant Protection Protocol, which is a policy that was started in January of 2019, saying that asylum seekers had to wait out their the entirety of the asylum process in Mexico. And what you've seen now is that there are camps there, and people who are waiting, and it's a process that getting asylum has always been very challenging. I've always said that to people. It's not like it's very easy. So it just makes it even more challenging for people. And they've added like different things. Like now you also need to prove that, that you're being targeted in Mexico. You know, so it's usually with asylum law, you're proving that you're here because you were persecuted in your country and because of something about yourself, but it has a lot to do with your country. These immigrants right now are only going to Mexico because we're sending them there. And so creating an even bigger hurdle, and also not educating people. So if you do not know that you need to prove this, then you won't. You're like, I just need to tell you why I fled my country in the first place. So there's all these like institutional like structure that makes it really, really hard for people to get asylum. It does, I know it sounds a little bit dramatic sometimes, but it does feel like in the recent years, there's been a flat out like attack on asylum. And we have done a lot of things that are so detrimental to particularly children and vulnerable populations. If you're already making this trip over here, it's probably because you've experienced a large degree of trauma. So to deal with this on top of that just seems really egregious. But I work primarily with unaccompanied children, and in 2014, 2016, we saw a lot of these, what we call the surge was in 2014, where a lot of the immigrant children were coming on their own. And now, because of recent policies, whether it's family separation of 2018 or this MPP protocol, we are creating situations where the children are unaccompanied. And that just like, it just blows my mind that we do that. Whereas at some point, yes, the children were coming alone. Right now, we're creating situations in which we've separated parents from their children and then processed the child as an unaccompanied child. Or right now, the people waiting in Mexico are facing a lot of danger and are subject to rape, trafficking, gang violence, the cartels. There's really nightmares of stories that I've heard. And sometimes the kids are left alone there. So then they decide to cross the border on their own. They become unaccompanied children. And sometimes the kids, they make that decision. It's like if as a family, and I can't imagine what that must be like to think, you know, we might die, but I want you to save yourself and try to cross the border. So that's just some of the things where I've seen, like, we're physically leaving people out, like we're doing this effectively. And of course, the other way that I see this in immigration is in the intersection of criminal law and immigration, and maybe Rexana can speak more about that. But there is over-policing of neighborhoods of minorities. And for immigrants, some even misdemeanors that may not seem like a big deal in regular criminal law are critical to their immigration cases and can cause them to be removed. And so I keep seeing that thread, right? It's like, we're going to separate you, we're going to remove you. And it's just, it's really wild how that happens. And if you compound all that with the color of your skin and with all the things that we've seen that have been going on, I can't imagine what that's like for somebody who's a Black man, let's say, who's also an immigrant. I think it's like adding stuff on top of stuff. But that was mainly what I was seeing when it comes to color and race, and how it kind of shapes the way that we do immigration in the United States.
Thank you for that. And I want to ask Mike next about ways that you're seeing this in the communities you serve. But I wanted to underscore quickly that, of course, these policies that Alejandro is talking about are occurring as a fulfillment of a campaign promise by President Trump. Asylum has never been easy. That's absolutely true. And yet the levels of hardship that are happening, particularly along the southern border, are clearly driven by promises made in the campaign that are based on, I'll just say the word racism. It's not maybe a word everybody agrees in all the political discourse, but given the way that the president speaks about the countries people are coming from and the nature of asylum seekers, I don't know a better word to use. And many people crossing the southern border, I'm so glad you mentioned the Haitians, and I know Cameroonians as well, are coming through South America because our doors are no longer open to them in some of the more traditional ways that they would come as students and workers and so forth. So it is one thing after another piling up. But Mike, tell us about what you're seeing.
Yeah, thank you, first of all, for having me today, and greetings to my brothers and sisters and future attorneys that are going to make a difference in the world. So I would start by saying that where I work, the organization I work, we provide legal services to people seeking legal protection, legal justice here in the United States and here in this community. And I would say the first thing is that for all of you to think about is that law and culture are really intertwined, and you see that through the experiences that our clients experience every day. So I'll give you a couple practical examples. So one would be an example where a resident who's Latino is told not long after President Trump is elected to go back to your home, go back, you don't belong here. Another experience is where an apartment complex denies housing to a family, and then we follow up and call the apartment complex to see if there's housing available. And because it might be somebody with not an accent, and the apartment complex says, oh, please, yes, we have plenty of apartments. And so examples like these happen all of the time where we're advocating on behalf of clients that are people of color and people that don't know how to navigate society. So I would say that belonging in America may begin with law in terms of what law defines, but that culture follows, and how we as nonprofits and those who donate to nonprofits influence that narrative will definitely send the image of what an immigrant is in American society forever. And so those are some initial thoughts that I'd share about just what we see on a daily basis and how important it is to really link law and culture together and framing the narrative. The one other thing that I would say is that my experience has kind of brought me in places like Baltimore and different nonprofits. And in the past 8 years before coming to this organization, I worked at national organizations. And there was always a dialogue about this idea of social justice and what's moral and what's right versus what people experience in quote unquote middle America. And one of the things I would urge future attorneys to think about is just language and how framing that narrative is so important to relate the people and the experiences of people who come to this country is very relevant to their ancestors and their own history to be able to make more movement and arguing and advocating on their behalf. So those are some opening thoughts.
Well, the historian in me loves that because every wave has had the same sort of action-reaction throughout history. There's nothing new under the sun when it comes to some of these issues. And finding that kind of common ground, I think, is a really helpful reminder. Roxana, you have seen these issues from multiple angles. Mike just specifically mentioned the housing issue, which is core to what you do now, but I would love your perspective now on where you see these issues cropping up in the communities you've worked with.
Absolutely. And I also have to echo the other panelists saying it's a great opportunity to connect and speak about these important issues, especially given the times. And I have to preface, because I do work for a federal agency, all of my responses on this webinar do not reflect the views or thoughts that of my agency or the administration. So I want to preface that and kick things off by saying, really, to understand how racism affects the experience of immigrants, it's important to understand how the civil rights movement is intertwined with immigration. Liz, you did a great job with outlining the timeline, and I'm going to specifically focus in the 60s. So the civil rights movement of the 1960s opened the doors to reforming immigration legislation. During that time period, race-based quotas were eliminated, and it allowed the US to make inroads to living up to its ideals when it comes to democracy, liberty, and opportunity. And Liz, I also just, if you don't mind sharing the infographic, I'm going to talk about some data points at this stage. So Black immigrants from the Caribbean islands of Jamaica, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic increasingly began moving to the United States in the 1960s. My family and many others benefited from the civil rights movement due to its impact from the Immigration Act of 1965 that was made into law. Voluntary Black migration significantly increased in the US from the 1980s on. And as you see in the infographic, it went from over 800,000 immigrants in the 80s to about over 4 million in 2016. And so it's important to note that racism is a social construct that artificially divides people into distinct groups based on characteristics such as their skin color or ancestral heritage. When immigrants migrate to the US based off of their perceived skin color, they're oftentimes categorized into second-class status, and they experience various forms of hostility. Race enables the dominant class to concentrate social and economic power to one specific group over another. And it's interesting to note that here in the United States, Black people only make up 13% of the total US population, and yet in 2018, Black Americans made up 1/3 of the total incarcerated population and made up about 40% of those experiencing homelessness. And Latinx and or Hispanic Americans, they are incarcerated at a rate of 1.4 times more than their white American counterparts. And this is not an accident, especially when it comes to people of color that are disproportionately targeted, whether it's related to criminal justice, housing, welfare, healthcare, or what have you. Navigating a foreign country while learning how to secure a job, secure educational opportunities, pay remittances back home, acculturating into a new society, and building social capital contributes to the many obstacles immigrants face in this country. And as some of the panelists have already shared, statutes, regulations, and policies that have been in place systematically disenfranchise communities of color, and it perpetuates the inequalities and limits upward mobility for communities of color, which also includes immigrant families and individuals. And as far as the racism and poverty piece, not to belabor the point, but an interesting book for folks to read, and I'll make sure to type it in the chat, The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. It goes into the details of how federal and state policies of the 40s and in the 50s and beyond permitted segregation and undermined the ability of Black families to own homes and build intergenerational wealth, which does impact vast swaths of communities of color. Laws that permitted redlining, restrictive covenants, and eminent domain adversely impact people's ability to own land, community of color specifically. And we know that home ownership is one of the largest drivers toward passing on wealth to one generation to the next. I do have to shout out CARES-NDC, the Central American Resource Center, which is an organization that I sit on the board for, and it was created over 38 years ago in the height of the civil war that was happening in Central America. In CARES, based out of Washington, DC, we have housing programs to help rectify the policies and laws that are in place for immigrant communities just to be able to have a piece of the American pie. With the housing program, its intent is to provide secure and affordable housing for immigrants in the DC area. And it was created out of the necessity to improve living conditions for low and medium income families, improving access to affordable housing, and ultimately increasing home ownership and asset creation among immigrants, especially Latinos. So I'm going to pause here because I know it was a lot, but just to be able to answer your question.
Wonderful. And I'm actually going to share the other infographic just for a moment because it is interesting. I don't know if you wanted to talk about that one at all, just in terms of where Black migrants are.
And so I'll just really touch on this real quick as folks see the infograph. Typically, it's not unique to Black immigrants. It's consistent with other immigrants. When families who immigrate from the home country to the US are able to make roots in a city, oftentimes metropolitan areas, you see there is an increase of migration flow to specific areas. So New York has the largest Black immigrant population in the United States, followed by Florida. So New York has a high Jamaican immigrant population, and Florida has a high Haitian population. And then the other parts that you see on the map, Minnesota, Wisconsin, has the largest Somali immigration or immigrant population because of crisis happening back in the home country. Maryland, DC area, where I'm from, there is a large swath of West Africans that are here, oftentimes because of family migration, diversity visa, or what have you. And same thing with Texas. Liz, you might be on mute.
Mute. Oh, bad hosting. This has come up a couple of ways lightly, but I just want to underscore that while African migrants often come to the United States feeling culturally different than African Americans, and for excellent historical and legal and cultural reasons, when it comes to policing, when it comes to how they are perceived by other members of the community, but especially by law enforcement, those distinctions go away. And that's, it's disorienting to the migrants, and it certainly, I think, creates common cause with African Americans whose forced migration happened, many generations prior. Those distinctions disappear when it comes to some of the hardships that we know exist in Black communities generally. Alejandra, just shifting gears a little because I want to start moving us in towards some of that common ground. You shared, as we were preparing this panel, you shared this beautiful song from Chile. And one of the lyrics in it is about the right to live in peace and how you reflected on all these issues through that. And I wonder if you could share your thoughts on that idea of
Yes, so
living.
I'm from Chile. I was born there during the dictatorship. And there's a lot of stuff that happened before I was born. And there was an activist, his name is Parra, and he wrote this song called the Right to Live in Peace. And there was a lot of civil unrest at the end of last year, and this song became popular again. And there were like current artists who did a remake of the song. I love covers. And it was beautiful because everybody recognized that, there's like these gaps. And what we see in other countries a lot is colorism. And of course, there's class. But as part of outreach with KIND, I went to an African-American church and at the beginning of the year, right before COVID hit. And I was trying to reflect on what to speak to this church about. And there's a wonderful woman who works there who's also a social worker. And she said, really speak to the congregation about why they should care about your cause. And I really, really thought about it, because I thought, wow, the Black community deals with so much. How can I ask them to care about, you know, unaccompanied children in their area? And I think at the end, and then I kept on thinking of that song, like who decides who gets to live in peace? Like, how did we get here where there's a group making decisions about who has a right to what? And it's all man-made. And so it was just a very deep thing, because I think we're all dealing with the same things. And then of course COVID hit, and then George Floyd, and everything happened. And it was just like, I can't believe that we're still here, where there's a group that decides not only whether like another group can live in peace and create for themselves and travel freely and, you know, have a job and do as they wish, be themselves, just show up in this world as they want to, and we want to control that. And so that it made me kind of sad. He wrote that song during the Vietnam War. And I was like, why is this still relevant right now? Like, why are we still really, really struggling with the same issues around this, where there's like a dominant group of people? And I think race is just a tool. It's just a way to do this, to have that, like Roxana so greatly explained in the beginning. And you know what I ended up thinking was that I don't have a scarcity conversation about compassion and love. There is enough, even though doing this work can be really exhausting, there is enough to go around. There's enough to care. And at the, really when you think about it, it's the same thing affecting, it's very, very similar things affecting different groups, right? Like we are being suppressed. It is minorities. It is Black and brown people. This is what's happening. It's very much in our faces. Liz, you mentioned also like police, and I remember there was a case with, and I think it was an African immigrant from like, I think 1993, in the New York City Police Department.
Amadou Jallo.
Yes.
From West Africa.
Heartbreaking. I mean, just heartbreaking when you think about that. But that was just like, oh my God, we keep doing this. And yeah, it just goes back so far.
Liz, I just wanted to say one thing about the driving experience, and just Latinos, we often hear about driving while Black. Many of our clients have experienced driving while Latino, where they have been pulled over. In one case, one had an ID. They have what's called TPS, temporary protected status. And the police told them that they knew it was fake, but it wasn't fake. And so that there are a lot of biases that you know, get into and seep into the biases that these different institutions like police have. We see that in what's going on in society today, but it's going on a regular basis through the services when immigrants come here and they try to get services. So if somebody goes to social services, for example, and they come up to a window and the social services person says, why can't you just speak English? You know, we shouldn't have an interpreter. And I think some of this too, I did see a question by one of the guests on the line about, you know, the United States sending money to these countries and why, you know, one of the things that it's really important for everyone to realize is that there's a perception that immigrants cost money. That's a perception that's not true, though. And actually, the reality is that if people on the right and capitalists in the truest sense would believe, if they believe in the free movement of capital is also labor and people. And those people actually make America stronger and make it and pay taxes and all of that. So I would encourage folks to think of it that way as extremely important. It goes back to the question of belonging that the other panelists have talked about.
I will jump in on that as well. I saw the couple of questions in the Q&A. And Roxana, there's one for you about homelessness I would love to turn to next. But just to also add, while it's true we send money to different countries, it's first, it's very tiny percentage of our overall federal budget. And my view, I think it's actually a good thing. What I've noticed from my clients over years and years and years of representation, almost 20 at this point, very few people wanted to come here just because. A few did. There's a few sort of really adventurous types who just wanted something different. Most people came because they really felt they could not stay where they were. And if there were a way for their communities to be places where they could thrive and be safe and raise their families safely, most of them would have preferred to stay. So to the extent there is a positive thing we can do to help that happen, I feel like that's something that actually brings, you know, potentially two sides of the debate onto shared ground. Alejandra, and then I'll go to
I just want to add really quick. It's really interesting when we think about other countries, because I do want people to do their homework and to think of the US involvement in other countries. So I think over here we'd like to say, hey, we're sending help over there. Look at us. We're so charitable. But the US has a lot of interest for very different reasons in all different countries. And so, for example, I'm going to talk about El Salvador because most of the children that I work with come from there. And I think that an argument could be made that the US has taken part in a lot of what has contributed to that country's instability. So there was a civil war in the 80s. There's a lot of stuff. The US tends to come in and support movements within countries sometimes that I think, again, for different reasons in different countries, I feel like many countries have experience with this. And then, but El Salvador is interesting to me because it's so close. And so we, in a sense, if we contribute to the instability of somewhere else, and then we have like mass migration because now it's really unsafe to come here, then we're like, oh my God, look at them. They want to come over here. It's like, well, wait a minute. Like, over the years, we have really, really contributed in some way. And sometimes it's in a large way, and sometimes it's in a small way, but really, really think about it. I just think it's a convenient narrative to say, like, the door is open for me to go to you whenever I need something, and then if that causes you some need, I'm gonna close the door after that.
Yeah. As good lawyers, we know it's all about shifting the frame, right? And if the framework is just 2014 to 2020, maybe there's one story, but if we stretch it back to 1980, certainly there's a very different story. Right. Roxana, I want to go back because there have been a couple of comments in the chat about homelessness and then maybe as another area where we can all get on the same page with common cause. And I wonder if you have some feedback.
Yes. So I also wanted to add to this discussion, but I'll focus on the homelessness piece first as far as what can be done when it comes to homelessness experienced by different groups. So the causes of homelessness vary, but a big part of it deals with structural racism. So the data point that I mentioned as far as the fact that in this country, a small population, so Black people making 13% of the population and are the ones that make 40% of people experiencing homelessness, that mirrors Indigenous communities in this country, Brown communities as well. Oftentimes when it comes to Latino and Latinas that are experiencing homelessness, it may not be as reported compared to other groups, and even Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders as well, because of this sense of community of doubling up. And what that means is folks are maybe staying with families or family friends. A home that may be able to support a family 4 might support a family of 8+ just because of necessity. And as we see the rising prices of homes and even apartments, it contributes to this factor of unstable housing. And so just wanting to get back to the question as far as what can be done, a big part of it is folks love to say that, yes, there is structural racism, there are laws and systems in place, but they just don't happen in the ether. There are people enabling these practices to continue on and on in order to maintain the status quo, regardless of political party. So it's important to really address things as they are, to be able to find solutions that meet families where they are, in particular immigrant families. And just something I'll reemphasize later in this webinar, from a legal perspective, federal statute provides protections to those who are entitled to them. That is the right. And so as the law stands today, outside of politics and opinions of others, we have a duty to carry out that law faithfully so that everyone can have their need met, which includes being safely housed.
Thank you for all of that. And just a sort of footnote on the issue of housing leading to overcrowding and so forth. Of course, we're seeing a massive ripple effect of that with the way that COVID is spreading through these communities, partly, not entirely, but partly due to overcrowded housing. I'm going to start this next question off with Roxana, but I think everybody will have something to say about it, which is when we focus on Black Lives Matter, because that really is where the activist energy is right now, and rightly so, what are the ways that focusing on the issues at the heart of Black Lives Matter will, just because of these shared issues, have a positive impact on other groups who might not be Black but face comparable barriers? How does Black Lives Matter sort of form the core of what it takes to improve things more broadly? Roxana, if you want to start.
Sure thing. So I do want to start off by saying the global Black Lives Matter movement, if anyone goes onto their website, and I'll try to send a link, it's committed to creating a world free of anti-Blackness, where every Black person has the social, economic, and political power to thrive. And so whether a person who is a Black immigrant or Black American has a fair opportunity to thrive in these respective spheres, all immigrants will have an opportunity to do so. We know that because statutes that have been in place for years, whether it was the Chinese Exclusion Act or a number of these laws, had detrimental impacts for other immigrant groups. And so when it gets to the point where there is equality and fairness for the collective Black diaspora, all immigrant groups will benefit, Black and Brown and Indigenous folks too. Disproportionalities would cease to exist. And I say that as a Black woman who's a daughter of African immigrants, that this Black Lives Matter movement is deeply personal to me and shapes the way I move in my career, leadership opportunities, and life generally. Representation matters, and it's important to continue to beat that drum so that those who need to be held accountable will be held accountable.
Hard to follow up from that, but Alejandra or Mike, just one of you want to add, or Roxana, your passion for this, but also your clarity of insight is just wonderful to listen to.
I would just say that one of the exciting things about the Black Lives Matter movement is that for the first time, it feels like there's a level of, there's a desire for consciousness that hasn't existed in the past. And that for those who are open, and I think there are more people today open to this desire for consciousness, it's opening the door to understanding about things like structural racism, and you know, books like the one that was mentioned earlier, like The Color of Law. These books are starting to sell in a big way. And for those that may be white or not, those in the suburbs that may not have been exposed to these issues, this open consciousness is an opportunity to look at all people of all color and what structural racism might exist across the board. And I mean, I can say that at Fern, what's been really interesting for me is to think about, you know, Roxana just mentioned that she's a child of immigrants. You know, we have interns that are working for us that are, say, one of our interns is the daughter of a Venezuelan and a Korean. And how does she identify herself in society, right? How do African children identify themselves as Black Americans, as Nigerian Americans, like, and that's those questions, or as Americans, you know, and it seems like the terminology that's used among in the legal space for referring to immigrant issues, it's you're an immigrant, you're a refugee, you're an asylum seeker, you're an asylee. Maybe we should think about the fact that they're all on some level new Americans, and think about a nomenclature that might identify more with the public as a whole.
Alejandra, do you want to jump in on this one as well?
Yes, I just want to say, I do think that when we elevate somebody, we are like elevating everybody. And I think that with the Black Lives Movement, it's us really asking the system to work how it says it does, and to do what it says it's supposed to do, right? So it's like, we have these laws, have them really apply to everybody equally, have them do all that. And I think that's an intersection for me with immigration, because I always think, when I say that I work in immigration, people always ask me, oh, are you for or against it, right? Like it's I don't know, like we're picking soccer teams, like where you're at. But what I think people don't understand is that I'm constantly, I feel like I'm constantly upholding like the structures that are in place already. Like we just want people to have access to things that, like Roxana mentioned before, they're entitled to, but they're being passed over, or you know, while you're not watching, there was a memo that went out that just like removes all these people. So to me, when we're asking for that, we're demanding that, like, you know, there's laws, let's follow them. It will inevitably like benefit everybody. So that's where I see the intersection of that. And that's why I believe that Black Lives Matter is so important to us. And before all this happened, I read Just Mercy, which is another book that I was just crying left and right reading that book, because I know it's true too, and we've seen it. So another great book, I'll add it to the chat.
Yeah, Mike mentioned earlier, the need to change the narrative, and I think what you're all talking about right now is about narrative change, and especially around the question of the rule of law. And sometimes I think the idea of the rule of law has been co-opted in a very narrow way by people, when it comes to immigration, by people saying, well, they shouldn't come. While, like Alejandra just said, immigration lawyers understand that the rule of law means that people have the right to a court hearing. They have the right to seek asylum. We can't pick and choose which laws, and that feels deeply relevant to Black Lives Matter as well. Claiming the protection of law that exists is not some sort of counter to the rule of law. It is part of the rule of law. I can't resist asking this question from the Q&A. Andrew Nguyen asked, what sort of systemic changes would you want to see either legislatively or in the judicial system to rectify some of these racial injustices? And I like that he's put two sort of venues for this. So I'll open that up to anybody. Dream big.
I'm going to hop on this one quickly. So, in a perfect world, being able to reimagine the legislator and the judiciary, what that looks like, having judges and legislators actually reflect the people they are supposed to govern or make decisions for, having more representation, people who also have the unique experiences that can be embedded in their decision making or their legislation drafting. When you have the actual experience, rather than just going through a very niche and narrow path to get to these points, things can change. The narrative can change, as what Mike has been talking about.
Alejandra, do you have a wish list?
The only thing I'm thinking about right now is that I wish that immigration court was not under like ER, Department of Justice, like when I try to think of equality, neutrality, not having those pressures that I think contribute to racism in these situations, it's that. And what Roxana mentioned, I think having diverse backgrounds, like diversifying that at the top. When you think about, for example, again, immigration judges, a large part of them are like ICE, people who worked for ICE or the Office of Chief Counsel. Like, it's just, it seems to be leaning in one direction all the time. So just to having that type of diversity, equity, and inclusion at every level so that people can understand different types of experiences and understanding that they hold value. And sometimes, you know, disability is very different. People don't understand that. Like, this person cannot defend themselves as well as somebody who can articulate these things, who can process these things. There's so many ways in which we shut people out. And so I wish that our justice system just reflected more inclusion in order to make informed decisions about their lives.
Mike, Fern is based in Howard County. I know your service area is larger, and I know there have been some tensions around immigration issues in Howard County, and some issues around racism in the public education system and whatnot. I'm curious if your programming supports the immigrants in navigating some of these race issues, or is there sort of a wish you have for how you could do some of that work, like how the context around your work could support anti-racism for these communities?
Yeah, about a year ago, there was a big redistricting fight over schools. And there were actually different immigrant groups. Actually, the Latino and African-American community were really pitched against the Chinese and Korean community. And that one of the things that Fern is about to launch is something called the New American Council, as a way to build bridges between different immigrant groups to build understanding. So that's what we are doing most evidently. What we do on a case-by-case basis is we try to connect immigrants to individual volunteers from the general community. And the real way to succeed in America is to have social capital. And that social capital comes from the networks that you have. And if you're African American, the chances are that your networks are not going to be as connected as if you're a white male like myself. And one of the things that we're trying to do is, how do we build more connections through volunteers that can connect immigrants to services and opportunities. And if we can do that, we can break down the barriers to people being, to society being more inclusive, not just in Howard County, but more regionally. So those are some of the practical things we're doing on a day-to-day basis, in addition to our legal services. I did want to say one thing to your earlier question. I don't have a policy answer to overcoming, you know, the judicial and legislative issues. But one thing that I would say is that it used to be in a place like Baltimore, for example, that immigrants would live next to each other. People of different color would actually live much closer to each other and be proximate. Because America is suburbanized, the opportunity to experience different people has actually declined. In the meantime, media and social media have gone on the upswing. And so people have to fight stereotypes that are on television, et cetera, that define the narrative. And that's what we've got to change. And I think the main way to change that would be to have some sort of national service, not military service, some sort of national service where people can experience one another and understand the complexity of issues so that you can break down structural racism through the laws that those people end up passing later.
And much like Peace Corps, the benefit might redound to people who think they're going into a community to be of use, and then they come back realizing how much they've sort of learned. You cannot expect an immigration law professor to pass over an opportunity to talk about legislative reform on immigration. So I will say briefly in answer to that question, there's a few different aspects of it. First, the host of things that people seek on the criminal legal system for reform impact massively immigrants in this country. So when police are arresting people for possession of marijuana, that, for just as one example, launches a cascade of effects in the immigration system, including, but first of all, that's a just possession of a certain amount makes you removable from the country regardless of how long you've been here, whether you have a green card or not. So not, the effects are dire. But the fact of a drug conviction, and we know those happen to a disproportionate extent in non-white communities, means that for the entirety of your immigration court hearing, you're in prison, immigration prison, because the law requires you to be there. So the criminal system feeds people in ways that make it even more difficult for them to fight their immigration cases, because these facilities are often 2 and 4 and 6 hours away from major metropolitan areas. So criminal legal reform, bail reform, those are 2 really key pieces. In the immigration system itself, I think we are just overdue for a new statute, because it is an extremely complicated law that has been, this iteration has been amended since 1952 any number of times. It's very difficult even for well-trained lawyers to navigate, to expect non-citizens who maybe have language issues on top of that to navigate it is too much. So those are my 2 big wishes. And there's a question in the chat about why can't they just obey the law? Of course, I mean, we want people to obey the law. If my teenager came home talking about possessing marijuana, I would not be a pleased mother. At the same time, the consequences of a violation are so disproportionate for immigrants than they are for anybody else, including veterans. Veterans get deported over drug convictions, and I feel like something is deeply askew with just the ratio of the consequences. Alejandra, you were going to jump in?
I was just going to say that it's, you know, there's like over policing, and then what Mike also said about driving while being Hispanic. I've had kids, so I work with children and, you know, and teenagers, and I've had them, let's say they just got their license, and I had one kid one time by mistake go like drive against in a one way, he drove the other way, and I wish that I could read you everything that he was charged with. I mean, it was just like this kid was like a criminal. They were adding things were like gross negligence, and like that he was a threat to the public, that he was like gonna destroy all the property there. I mean, they really went to town with this. And when you see something like that, you're just like, wow, there's no room for that. I cannot say, hey, like that's like this highly criminal act, and they're kids, and there's just no grace, and it kind of tips the other way completely. And for them, it's dire. It means, like Liz said, it means that they are going to get, that they're gonna have to like be deported. And so I end up doing things which I don't really like, which is like, I try to restrict their own liberties. So I'm just like, hey, listen, I know you can drive. I know your mom who's really sick could use you driving, but I really need you to take the bus. Like, I need you to take the bus, and I need you to come home. I have said this to kids sometimes, like, I need you to stay home and not like go out as much, not do as much, not have, you're already in a vulnerable situation, and I can't have you be out there exposed to anything more, because you are a target. And it's so sad.
It's analogous to what I understand many Black parents have to say to their children about being twice as good and working twice as hard, because the consequences are just so much more draconian. We are unfortunately at 6 o'clock. We don't have to end immediately, but I want to give you all just a moment or two to say any final thoughts you have. And I challenge you, if possible, to find something positive to say to guide us into the future. Roxana, you're smiling, so you may go first.
Okay, I don't have my thought in my head yet, but I'll just say, to end on a positive note, in order to really change the narrative of how immigrants, especially Black and brown immigrants, are treated in this country, there has to be a reckoning. And I think we are in a ripe moment in time to do that. Change isn't just within the systems, it's within. When we're able to identify our own biases and perceptions of anti-Blackness, we can move the needle forward so that the rights that are guaranteed in laws for immigrants and communities of color, for those rights to actually be met without hurdle after hurdle. So change starts within.
Thank you. Alejandra?
Yes, and I do think that just the fact that we're all gathered here right now is a testament to all that. You know, something drew you to this webinar, something drew us to this panel, and I think we got to hold on to that and really look at ourselves and see how we are contributing to some things. But I also want to say that I am very humbled that I get to do this work. I love what I do. It is feels very heavy sometimes. It's challenging, but it feels incredibly important to also, I guess, be like walking the talk during a time that's calling for social justice and action. I guess I feel like I fulfill that through my job. I'm constantly there. And I, on a very personal level, love that for people who have been marginalized, I step in and I'm just like, for this aspect of your life, I'm in your corner and I'm gonna fight for you. And that is incredibly rewarding for me. This is great work. If you have any interest in this, Fern is a great organization. Carecen is also a great organization. I work for KIND. We take legal interns all the time. I put that in the chat. But if you want an experience in which you can see a palpable like effect of your work, by all means, get out there, do the work. It's so good. It's so good.
And Mike?
I would say to everyone that you have agency, that you don't have to be helpless watching social media. You don't have to be helpless watching the news. There are many organizations where your hands, your mind will make a big difference. And even if nonprofits ask for money, that's not the most important thing. So that's one thing to keep in mind. One or 2 years ago, I was with a Syrian family that came here and was resettled. And they were living in a really bad neighborhood of Detroit. And they sat around a table with us and offered us tea in a really rundown home that they were living in temporarily. And they had gratitude. So this perception that people of other races, people of, from different parts of the world, Muslims, what have you, are not grateful when they come here and don't contribute is not right. And you have agency to bring those lives into the full panoply of American life. So thank you.
And thank you to all of the panelists. I have to say, and on a personal note, to say events in this country in recent months, but even this week with Jacob Blake in Wisconsin, have been challenging to my own sort of morale and how much I feel like I can sustain doing some of this work. But being in this conversation with you and having still 41 people on the call makes me feel energized. And I have to say in particular to Alejandra and Roxana, you're the reason for all the good work, right? Like, you had an opportunity and look what you're doing with it. And I'm so grateful to you for that. I'm grateful to all three of you for joining today. And thank you so much to everybody who stayed with us and asked the wonderful questions in the chat. We hope we'll see you at these future webinars, and thank you.